Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tuttle Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tuttle Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that he rose from the grave 3 days later to give us new life in him. If you'd like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description. It will take you to a full gospel presentation. It'll also show you how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship right here on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock in the morning. We're both in person and online through Facebook Live. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, we are now in session 5, which is titled Lack of Trust. And we're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 through 13. So again, this is session 5, titled Lack of Trust. And we're going to be looking at Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 through 13. As we dive into our study today, I want to begin by reading the introductory paragraph to the personal study guide. And it begins by saying these words. It says, people generally fall into two categories: those who read and follow the instructions, and those who think they can figure it out as they go along. Those who fall into the latter category may do so because of a heightened self-confidence, impatience, or a history of past successes. Sometimes, though, at the end of the project, those in the second category may be left with extra unused parts or an end product that doesn't quite look like it was supposed to. That leads the book to ask a couple of questions to start off our study, which is this. Do you find yourself in category 1 or category 2? And with that, why is it that you tend to have that tendency? And on what kinds of tasks is it more important for you to follow instructions, all the way to the end? And so there's kind of multiple things there, but are you typically a person that follows directions, or are you typically one who does not? And really, why and what is often the result of that? And I'm sure that for a lot of you that may depend on the situation, but when does it depend? How does it depend? What times are you more likely to be a category 1 person, and what times are you more likely to be a category 2 person? And then what has been some stories that have come up with that? We're going to ask questions like these throughout our study. And what we want you to do is we want you to actually take some time to really interact with them by pausing the video. If you're watching by yourself, writing some things down, get a pen, paper, give yourself an opportunity to respond. Or if you're watching this with friends, family, whoever it may be, take the time to really have a discussion, to talk through it. And then in both cases, just whenever you're ready, hit play again, and then we'll keep going in our study. So again, the question is what category do you fall into? Are you category 1, which is always follows directions from start to finish, every time or almost every time? Or are you more category 2 that says, no, I don't typically follow directions. I typically just go for it. And then with that, why are you one or the other? And what is often the result of doing that? So take a couple minutes, pause the video, take some time to interact with that question. And whenever you're ready, hit play again, and we'll keep going in our study. All right, so hopefully you've had an opportunity to answer that question. I will be honest, I would think probably the overwhelming majority of the time I'm category 1. And I think part of that is because I can't always just look at the pieces and say, okay, this goes here and that goes here and just put it all together super easy. But I'm definitely not always that way. And there's a few things that kind of factor into it. One, if it's something that I've done before, if I've made it before and it's really easy to kind of figure out how it all goes together. That may be a time where I'm like, oh yeah, pop, 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 and put the screw here and tighten this and all that, and I do it fairly quickly. But almost without fail, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to get everything out of the box. If it's furniture, if it's a toy for one of my kids, something like that, I'm going to get all of the things out of the box, and then I'm going to look at the directions and say, okay, what's going on here? And sometimes even to the point of separating out all of my pieces to get them all there. Now, I'll be honest, there's a lot of times on there where I will kind of say, okay, well, obviously I did this, so now I need to do this and all that. And even then, and probably one of the reasons why I follow directions so often is even then, a lot of times if I jump ahead and say, oh, well, clearly this goes here, I realize after the fact that I needed to pay closer attention to either how that went or there was something that had to be put in place before that piece did, or otherwise it wasn't going to fit together, or I wasn't going to be able to put that piece in. And so, having said all that, typically for me, I follow those directions because I've had enough times where I've jumped ahead or I've tried to do it on my own and found myself, really more than anything, found myself in a place where now I have to take apart, go backwards, take apart whatever I'm building in order to put that piece in order to correct something so that then I can move forward again. And I'd rather just do it right the first time and not end up with extra pieces or find myself having to redo the job because I missed a step that matters at the end. The book has this to say. It says sometimes even people who normally follow directions skip them because they think they know what they should do. That's me. Sometimes this could lead to serious difficulties and unintended problems. Today's study passage comes from Numbers 20. As we account a time when Moses, usually a person who followed God's directions, made a choice and acted according to his own plan. As a result, Moses experienced a painful consequence. So as we dive into our study in verse 20, we're going to have moved forward quite a bit in our story. They have obviously been exiled now. They are not entering the promised land. They go out from there. There is a rebellion in Numbers chapter 16 where a group of people questioned the validity of Moses' leadership and the leadership of Aaron and tried to rise up against them and tried to assert their own claim to leadership. This has disastrous consequences as those who question the leadership of Moses and Aaron are ultimately quite literally swallowed up by the earth. And then even now, as we enter into Numbers 20, they are still feeling the effects of that, but there is still a lot of mistrust and anger and people being upset with Moses and Aaron and their leadership. And really by extension, and we'll see that in our study, even as we dive into it, really by extension, they're questioning and they have an issue with the leadership of God and the consequences really of their own actions. So let's dive into our study a little bit. We're going to look at Numbers chapter 20. We're going to start off reading verses 2 through 5. And as we do so, I want you to notice what the complaints were that the Israelites leveled against Moses. What did they have a problem with? So let's pick up in verse 2 and read through to verse 5. It says this: "There was no water for the community, so they assembled against Moses and Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, 'If only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness for us and our livestock to die here? Why have you led us up from Egypt to bring us into this evil place? It is not a place of grain, figs, vines, and pomegranates, and there is no water to drink.'" And so as we get into this, we see the complaints that they have. And it's interesting because they say, like, why did you bring us to this place? They talk about how they basically, probably a group came together, and it says, that they assembled against Moses. They brought a group together, probably appointed a group of leaders to go and complain to Moses and to Aaron. And that's what that word kind of quarrel means, is they really kind of went to level charges against Moses to complain and say, this is what you are doing. This is what we have a problem with. And when that happens, notice the complaints they have. They say, if only we had perished like our brothers. This is talking about Korah, what I mentioned from number 16. And they're basically saying, first off, it would have been better for us to have gotten swallowed up by the earth and died instantly, I think would be the way they would say that, than to come here and eventually starve and die of dehydration. With that, we wish that we had rather not been here at all, that we had just stayed in Egypt, that we had stayed slaves, stayed there. And really, at the last thing there, he says, you brought us to this evil place. You promised us grain, figs, vine, pomegranates in the promised land. And yet here we are dying of dehydration and we are dying because of a lack of water, and kind of even asserting that you have not kept the promises that you have made to us. And this is just crazy when we think about it, because we know what the situation actually is. We know why they are here. We know why they're in this situation, and yet they still complain and act like they are the victims and not actually the one who is guilty and the one who is reaping the consequences of their own actions. So this is the quarrel. This is the complaint that they've leveled against him. The book explains it this way. It says, verse 2 says that the people assembled against the leaders. Although not violent, they were intense and assertive. When the people complained about the lack of water 40 years earlier, they asked, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us with thirst? This was in Exodus 17. Here, they said they would have preferred if they had perished with their brothers who had died, likely a reference to those who had died in the Korah's rebellion against Moses. And so we have this idea of wishing that they had some different thing, and looking back into things of the past and looking at them as being more favorable than their current situation, kind of a good old days mentality. And the book actually asks a question in regards to that. It says, why do we tend to romanticize the good old days even though they weren't always so good? Why don't you take a couple of minutes, pause the video, answer that question. Why do we tend to romanticize the good old days even when they're not that great? And think about that, and also think about how that relates to our trust in God and those type of things. Take a couple of minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then whenever you're ready, hit play again, and we'll keep going in our study. All right, hopefully you've had a time to answer that question. I think a lot of times we look on the way things used to be, and we remember the good things and we remember them fondly, and we just tend to forget the bad things. We just tend to not really bring those things up. We don't make as a big a deal about them. And that ends up, after time, the things that we don't remember are the bad things, and the thing that we do remember tends to be the good things, to the point that we kind of start to believe that, hey, back in the day it was all good. And so, I'm a product of the 80s. I grew up in the 80s, and a lot of times I look back on the things and the way things were in the 80s, and I think to myself, oh man, like things were so much better in the 80s, and I liked it so much better back then. But then if you really think about it, there's a lot of things that were not so great, and there was a lot of bad things, and there was a lot of things that probably just because I was a kid I didn't even know about. I didn't understand how bad they were. If you were a kid during the time in Egypt, and you weren't really working in the brick fields, and you weren't really a slave in the sense that your parents were, you may look back on Egypt and say, hey, it wasn't so bad. I was a kid, I was running around, I was playing, I didn't have much, but I didn't know I didn't have much. When in reality, your parents were slaves and being beaten and doing backbreaking work every day, and you're just oblivious to it. And so there's an idea of ignorance there. There's only remembering the good stuff and tending to not remember the bad stuff. And we just tend to do that. I think we do that in church. I think we do that in life. I think we do that in the world around us, our culture. And sometimes what ends up happening is we have memories that either disregard or just flat out don't remember what actually made things harder, and how we should be more appreciative. In light of all that, this quarrel that the people had with Moses was in reality a quarrel against God, and we're going to see the consequences of that soon. In addition to their bondage in Egypt, the people also forgot that they weren't that they weren't enjoying prosperity because of their nation's sin. They still struggled to take responsibility for their own actions. And I think that is something that we most certainly do today. We tend to forget that a lot of times the things that we're going through and the issues that we are facing is not because just we live in a bad world and Satan is out to get us and all those things, but often it is our own sin, our own selfishness, our own unwillingness to trust in God and to trust in what He is doing in our life that leads us through some hard times. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to come to the Lord in confession and repentance, and just trusting that He is doing something good, even through these times where we have to kind of take our lumps and learn from our sinful things. Let's look forward again. Let's look at what kind of the response is and what happens next. And I think this we'll begin to see what God is doing. And I want you, as we read Numbers 20, verses 6 through 8, I want you to listen for the actions that Moses and Aaron took, and also listen for what God told them to do. So let's dive into this, picking up in verse 6. We're going to read through verse 8. It says, Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting. They fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord spoke to Moses, and he said, Take the staff and assemble the community. You and your brother Aaron will speak to the rock while they watch, and it will yield its water. You will bring out water for them from the rock and provide drink for the community and for their livestock. So let's think about this real quick. There are two things happening here. First off, let's think about the response of Moses. They hear the complaints, and what they do is they withdraw from the assembly. They don't keep the complaint fest going. They don't allow the crowd to keep getting riled up and upset, and they go to the Lord. And they go to the Lord. They go to the tent of meeting, which is where they encounter God, and they just fall face down. This is an act of prayer. This is an act of submission. This is like a posture of intense prayer, I think. And both of them basically take it to God, and they go to the Lord in prayer. They go to the presence of God, and they are seeking the Lord's guidance. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And we're going to see how Moses does right here, but he doesn't necessarily do right at the end. And his response to this is not to find his own solution, not to do his own thing, but to seek the Lord. And I think that's an important thing to learn. And then we see what God tells him to do. God tells him, okay, you're going to provide water for the people. This is what you're going to do. Bring the people together. And there's this rock. And it would have been, we tend to think of this as just like a big stone, something that might be over in eastern Kentucky or something like that, where there's this big rock there. This would have been like a rock formation. It probably would have been very significant. And I kind of, in my mind, I kind of had this visual of like some rock formation maybe prior to the mountain where they're at. And so this is going to bring about water, like a spring is just going to come out of this rock, and a spring is going to flow out from there. And so he says, you're going to go to this rock formation. You're going to bring everybody together. You're going to speak to the rock, and the water is going to come forth, and you're going to take care of them. You're going to take care of their animals, all of those things. The book says it's this. It says, Moses and Aaron position themselves in prayer before God. So that's the first part of that. And it goes on to say this: face down was the common position when interceding for God's people. Moses and Aaron did this when the Israelites refused to enter Canaan. They also fell face down when God threatened to destroy the people after Korah's rebellion. Jesus assumed the same position when he pleaded, "Let this cup pass from me," in Matthew 26:39. Each instance was a desperate prayer. The position communicates an anguished and humble attitude, which is exactly what we want. That leads the book to ask this question: what kinds of difficulties get you face down, either literally or figuratively, before the Lord? And why don't you take a couple minutes, pause the video, and answer that question. What are some things that might happen in your life that would lead you to take that prostrate position and go before the Lord in a position that communicates anguish and humility towards God? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, answer that question, and then we'll keep rolling in our study. All right, hopefully you've had some chance to answer that. For me personally, there are a lot of things where I just have to acknowledge my complete lack of control in situations, and I have to take them before the Lord. As a pastor, I'll tell you, one of the things that's going to be most likely to do this for me is when I'm in conflict with another person within the church or another leader, in our community as it relates to kind of church things. Those are going to be the type of things that draw me to that level. And really, if I'm honest, a lot of things as it relates to my family. My dad was sick a few years ago, definitely during those times. My relationship with my wife, my children, issues of health that have happened throughout my family, and some of even my church family when they've gone through some really, big bouts with health issues, surgeries and whatnot. Those are the things that often bring me to that place where I am face down before the Lord, just imploring Him and begging Him to act and to move, and that's a good thing. I've heard people say before, when the life brings you to your knees, that's exactly where God wants you to be, so that you can pray to Him. And so sometimes we do face these things in life, and really what they end up being is these huge opportunities for growth and opportunities for us to trust in the Lord even through extremely difficult times. The book has this to say. It says, Moses used the staff in Exodus 17 to bring water from a rock. In Numbers 17, God also used Aaron's staff to quiet Israel's complaints. In verse 8, God instructed Moses to use the staff to assemble the people, but to speak to the rock in order to bring out the water. Let's see what happens as a result of that. So Moses has gone to the Lord. God has said, you are going to bring water from a rock like you've done before, but this time assemble the people with your staff, but then speak to the rock. And let's see what happens. We're going to pick up in verse 9 and we're going to read through the rest of 13. And I want you to consider what Moses and Aaron's attitudes were when they assembled the Israelites. And I think that's an important clue here in what's about to transpire, is not so much what they did, but what it revealed about their attitudes or their hearts. So picking up in verse 9, we read these words. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded them. Moses and Aaron summoned the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring water out of a rock for you?" Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff, so that abundant water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me to demonstrate my holiness in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring the assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and he demonstrated his holiness to them." So let's think about that. Let's look at all that's going on here and just kind of the whole picture. First, let's look at what was the people's demand. So the people wanted water. They went to Moses and they said, "We want water. You have brought us out." It would have been better if we had aligned ourselves with the sons of Korah, aligned ourselves with the people who'd been engulfed, because at least then we wouldn't have to die of dehydration and starvation. And then they confront the people. And I get the feeling that this is a very pointed quarrel. You use that word quarrel, where they're saying, like, you brought us to this mess. This is your fault. You better fix it, or we're going to find someone who does. There's a point here, even to the point where we see that Moses says that you guys are rebels. And that's what we see going into this. We wanted to kind of think about what Moses and Aaron's attitude were. And we see that in the passage where with the terms they use, they say, "Listen, you rebels." So there's name calling. "Must we bring water out of this rock for you?" And so there's this idea where Moses and Aaron are getting fed up with the Israelites. They are tired of being the ones that have to deal with these people. And even to the point, though, but they're taking it on themselves. "We are dealing with you. We bring the water out of the rock. We are doing this." And we're seeing this shifting away from why aren't you trusting in God? Why aren't you trusting in the promises of God? To say, why are you making this so hard on me? Why do I have to do everything? Why do you complain to me all the time? And I really do feel like we're seeing a shift in Moses here, and it's not going to be a short shift, but it's going to be a very detrimental one to him, where now it's suddenly becoming all about him and all about Moses and Aaron, and that we have to keep doing stuff for you, and you are making our lives difficult. And there's this shift to it being all about me. And I think that's something that we as Christians need to remember, because of the consequence, because of their statement and because of their shift to me. Then they do what they do and not what God called them to do, which is, instead of speaking to the rock, he said, "Call the people with my staff, but speak to the rock." Instead, he speaks to the people and hits the rock with his staff. And in fact, it says that he rose up his arm and he struck it twice. The idea here is he hit it hard. He took this staff that God had given him, and God had told him what to do, and he used it not in the way that God told him to use it, but he literally just hammered, struck this rock 2 times very hard, and the rock, I'm assuming, kind of cracks open and the stream comes out. And here's the issue, is it makes it look like Moses did it. Moses hit the rock. Moses hit this rock so hard that water came out of it, that it was like Moses' ability, Moses' strength, Moses' powerful rod, whatever it is, Moses' magic, whatever. And it makes it look like what happened, and the reason water came out of it was because of Moses. Why must we bring water out of the rock for you? Basically saying, me and Aaron, we are going to give this water to you. And because they had shifted their attitude away from God and their trust in God and shifted it to these people, we have to do these things to this people, they ultimately disobey God, kind of almost want to steal God's glory and God's holiness. And because of that, God says, you messed up. You should have gone to the people and showed them my power, my holiness, and my provision for them. And instead, you tried to steal that from me. You stole that glory. You stole that focus on me and that opportunity to worship me. You stole that away and you put it on yourself. And for that reason, you will not enter the promised land. Failing to follow God's instruction, Moses struck the rock. Because of this disobedience, he and Aaron would not enter the promised land. And that leads the book to ask this question: what does it say about God's character that he provided the water even though Moses and Aaron had disobeyed him? Take a couple minutes, pause the video, go work through that question, and then we're going to start wrapping up our study. All right, so what does this reveal about God? Well, first, I think and foremost, it reveals that God was still a provider. He had every intention of providing for these people, and he had every intention of bringing them into the fulfillment of the promise and allowing Israel to take to promised land, and providing water in this moment at this time was part of that process. God was going to keep his promise towards these people even in the midst of their disobedience, even the disobedience of their believers. This is one of the things that we always need to remember about God, is no matter how far we get away from him, no matter how many times we as a church or as individuals or even as Christianity as a whole misrepresent him and get things wrong and all of those type of things, he is still going to fulfill everything that he's promised. Christ is still going to return. He is still going to set all things right. There is still going to be a new heaven and a new earth. And we cannot thwart those plans. And God, in his grace and his mercy, is still even going to use sinful people like us to accomplish his perfect will. And that's a wonderful thing. And it just speaks to this Old Testament word we've used a lot, especially in the book of Psalms, which is God's faithful love, his steadfast love towards us. And even when we are rebellious, even when we disobey, even when we try to steal his glory, his steadfast love is going to ultimately provide for us, even though there are going to be consequences to that. And I think we see that here. The word Meribah, as we read in our last verse there, means contention or strife, or even just the word quarrel. And the name reflected how the people were quarreling with God rather than trusting him and being obedient to him. And the important thing to note there is that their quarrel really was with God, that he wasn't fulfilling his promise, that he wasn't taking care of them. And Moses and Aaron took that to heart when they should have recognized that this was an issue of God's glory and God's holiness and not their own. This leads to ask the book to ask this question, which is, what do we communicate to God when we follow his instructions? And what do we communicate to him when we don't follow his instructions? And I want you to take a couple minutes, pause the video, and really take some time to answer that question. What do we communicate to God when we follow him? And what do we communicate when we fail to follow him or when we don't follow him? Take a couple minutes, answer that question, and then we'll wrap up our study. You know, I often give the analogy when I talk about faith and the idea of having faith or trusting in God, of the analogy of the dad who's in the pool, inviting his child to jump into the pool and saying, "I'll catch you." And I've gotten to do that with all three of my kids especially when they were little. And if they've got their little puddle jumpers on and we're playing at a pool, maybe we're in a hotel or wherever we are, at my mom's house, wherever we are where there's a pool, and I'll be standing there and I'll say, "Jump, I'll catch you." And then they have to do it. And so I'll say, "Jump and I'll catch you." And they may not do it. They kind of stand there grinning for a little bit. And I'll say, do you trust me? I'll catch you. Do you believe me? I'll catch you. And they may say yes. I'll say, "Okay, jump." And the reality is they may say they believe me and they may say they trust me and they may say that they think that I'll catch them, but until they finally jump and give me the opportunity to catch them, the reality is they didn't really believe me. And I think that's true when it comes to obedience and following God's instructions at anywhere in the Bible, is where God is asking the question, do you trust me? Even in the wilderness, even as they are reaping the consequences of their disobedience at the edge of the promised land, at Canaan's edge, The reality is through all of this, God is saying, do you trust me? I will take you places. I will move you places. I will provide food. I will provide manna. I will provide water. I will provide all things for you. Do you trust me? And we can say we trust God all the time, but until we actually obey and follow his instructions and do what he has told us to do, the reality is we didn't really. And I think that that is something that we also communicate to the world around us. We live in a world that is desperately groping after truth, and truth is not always just what we say, but it's also what we demonstrate by how we make our choices. If we say we trust in Jesus and we say that we follow him, but then we don't do the things that the Bible clearly calls us to do and clearly tells us to do, how can we say that we're trusting in him? And on top of that, the people from the outside looking in will say, he says he trusts them, but then he doesn't obey. Does he really trust? Does he really believe? Does he really have faith? And so it matters, and it's an important thing. And I think that how we live really does more to communicate whether we trust God and whether we've placed our faith in him than what we say and how often we attend church. As we close out our time, I want to do something that the book recommends doing. As we close out our time, I want you to think about the ways in your life that you have failed to trust God, where you have said you trust him, but then you've gone your own way, or you've done what the world's told you to do, or you've sinned in some other way. And I want you to close out your time today, and I want you to pray. I want you to talk to God. I want you to ask him for forgiveness in the places that you have failed him, in the places that you have failed to trust him. But then also, I want you to ask God for continued guidance in your life, even when circumstances are difficult. So I want you to kind of go to God, much like we see in Moses here, and I want you to ask God for forgiveness for the times that you have not done what he said, where you've not done what he has called you to do, and then ask God that he would continue to guide you and to guide your life, even when you get into difficult situations like we see in the wilderness today. Take your time, close out your time in prayer, and then we would invite you to join us for worship right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. We are both in person and online at 11 o'clock. We hope you'll join us. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Sunday school lesson. God bless.